When Simon Barret appeared at the door of the Carson City police station on an early spring morning, he barely resembled the man who had gone missing 8 months earlier at Lake Tahoe, gaunt to the point of being skin and bones, eyes dull and clouded, and his left hand missing 2 fingers. The fisherman who was presumed to have drowned in the freezing depths of the lake was now standing there, with no identification, no explanation, carrying only a strange bag that didn't belong to him. But what truly unsettled the investigators wasn't his physical condition. The real horror lay in what that bag suggested. And in the 8 months, Simon had survived in a place no one knew about, in ways no one wanted to imagine. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the latest cases. On the morning of June 3, 2016, the public boat ramp area near Tahoe Keys Marina looked as familiar and almost monotonous as ever. The surface of Lake Tahoe lay flat and calm under the pale early summer sunlight. Pickup trucks were scattered across the damp concrete, still wet with morning mist, and a few men quietly prepared their boats. There was no sign whatsoever that this place was about to become the starting point of a disappearance. Simon Barret, 41 years old, appeared in that scene as a completely natural part of the marina, a man who had been tied to this lake for more than 2 decades and lived according to the repeating rhythm of commercial fishing. He wasn't a risk-taker, nor was he someone chasing thrills. Simon lived an orderly life, renting a small house in South Lake Tahoe, working seasonal jobs, and fishing on his own the rest of the time. He rarely traveled far, rarely changed his routine. According to people who knew him at the marina, Simon always left the dock at the exact same time every morning, carrying just enough supplies for a short trip, and he always returned before dark, no matter how good or bad the catch was. That morning was no different. Simon drove to the ramp, checked his boat, loaded a few familiar pieces of gear, and pushed off along the same water route he had traveled countless times before. No rush, no argument, no noticeable signs of stress. That was the last time Simon Barret was seen in a completely normal state, blending into the quiet rhythm of Lake Tahoe life the way he always had. The afternoon passed without any unusual signs, but as the sun began to drop behind the Sierra Nevada range and the marina grew quieter, Simon still hadn't returned. At first, the delay didn't immediately alarm his family. Sometimes fishing trips ran longer than expected because of changing currents or weather. But as more time passed with no call, no message, Simon's phone went unreachable, and no one at the marina remembered seeing him come back. Unease began to spread. His family contacted people who regularly saw him on the lake, checked the places he sometimes stopped at after leaving the ramp, but no leads appeared. What made the situation truly concerning wasn't that Simon had been gone for a few hours. It was that his absence was completely incompatible with the way he lived. Always on time, always letting someone know, always coming home. When night fell, and there was still no sign that Simon would return, his family had no choice but to accept that this was no longer a routine delay. They gathered the last pieces of information from that morning, confirmed the time he left the ramp, the familiar route he usually took, and the fact that he had vanished from every normal pattern of his own life. The call to the police was made in a mixture of hope and dread, not to report a witnessed accident, but to report an inexplicable gap in the otherwise very stable life of Simon Barret. From that moment on, his disappearance was no longer just a private family concern. It was officially recorded as a missing person case at Lake Tahoe, one that began on a perfectly ordinary morning and ended in a long, unexplainable silence. After the family's call was received, Simon Barret's case was quickly transferred to the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, where investigators handled it according to standard protocol for a missing person case involving a water environment. In those first few hours, the working assumption still leaned heavily toward an accident, because while Lake Tahoe may look calm on the surface, it has long been known for its cold, deep currents dangerous enough to put even the most experienced people at risk. An initial file was opened. The last confirmed time Simon was seen leaving the boat ramp was verified, and his familiar routine was documented in detail to serve as a baseline for comparison. Search teams were mobilized almost immediately, including local law enforcement, lake rescue units, and several volunteers familiar with the area's terrain. The search was launched in multiple directions at once, starting with the open water where Simon usually fished, then expanding to the shoreline areas and the trails leading from the ramp into the forest paths a person in distress might try to reach if they needed help. Patrol boats moved slowly across the lake, scanning each section with the naked eye and positioning equipment, while other teams combed rocky shores, docks, and low-lying stretches of land where someone could become stranded. During that process, Simon's boat was discovered drifting near a familiar area, not far from the water route he normally took. The boat was in intact condition, no signs of collision with submerged rocks or another vessel. The engine showed no obvious damage, and most importantly, there were no indications whatsoever of a struggle having taken place. The discovery of the unmanned boat immediately became the focal point of the initial search phase, but at the same time it raised even more questions, because it didn't fit the scenario of a violent accident on the water. Investigators documented the boat's location, direction of drift, mechanical condition, and conducted a careful inspection of every detail, yet they found no factor that could explain why Simon was no longer there. As the search area continued to expand, some of Simon's personal items were recovered during the sweep of the area items he would normally have carried while fishing but that were not on the boat when it was found. What mattered to the authorities was that these items were not discovered at a clear scene or concentrated in a single spot. Instead, they appeared scattered throughout the search effort, which meant they could not be treated as direct evidence of violence or criminal activity. Each find was carefully logged, sealed, and entered into the case file with the necessary caution, but none of the items showed traces of blood, sabotage, or any clear criminal element. In parallel with the physical search, police interviewed everyone who had been at the marina on the day Simon went missing, checked traffic cameras and security cameras around the area to determine whether any unusual vehicles or individuals had appeared. The data collected painted a fairly simple and frankly confusing picture. Simon left the ramp as usual. His boat was found intact. No witnesses saw an accident, and there were no signs of third-party involvement. In the following days, the search continued at high intensity. Dive teams were deployed in deep, cold water zones, while shore teams kept sweeping every stretch of lakeside and every trail leading into the forest. Still, none of the efforts produced any specific new leads. No signs of violence, no criminal evidence, no discovery strong enough to force investigators to shift toward a criminal hypothesis. To the police, in those early days, Simon Barrett's case was recorded only as a puzzling missing person incident that had not yet stepped outside the framework of a possible accident in the harsh natural environment of Lake Tahoe, a beautiful lake that always carries risks and doesn't always leave clear explanations behind. After many consecutive days of conducting high-intensity searches without obtaining any additional specific leads, the authorities were forced to adjust their approach to Simon Barrett's disappearance in accordance with standard procedures for similar cases. The search area was gradually narrowed, beginning with the withdrawal of volunteer teams and a reduction in the frequency of patrols on the lake surface, instead shifting focus to rechecking the zones with the highest likelihood of an accident based on weather data, currents, and Simon's fishing habits. Dive teams completed their sweeps of the deepest and most dangerous water areas near the route Simon typically traveled, but they found no body, no clothing, nor any sign indicating that a drowning had occurred. On shore, the examination of trails, rocky beaches, and lakeside areas also yielded no different results. No evidence suggesting Simon had ever attempted to reach land in a life-threatening state. As each possibility was checked and then ruled out, the case file gradually shifted from an emergency search status to a re-evaluation phase, where investigators had to confront the reality that the initial efforts had not produced clear answers. The absence of a body, in the context of Lake Tahoe being a deep, cold lake capable of retaining a victim for a long time, was not unprecedented, and that very factor meant Simon's case was not immediately considered abnormal compared to previous accident incidents. In parallel with scaling back the search, investigators continued to re-examine everything that had been collected from the location where the boat was found, its mechanical condition, to the personal items discovered scattered during the search. All of it was reviewed again, with the goal of determining whether any overlooked detail might suggest a scenario other than an accident. The outcome of that process remained unchanged. No signs of violence, no evidence of third-party intervention, no criminal evidence strong enough to redirect the investigation toward a criminal hypothesis. In that context, the authorities reached a preliminary conclusion, officially recorded in the file, that Simon Barret had most likely suffered a water-related accident while fishing, a scenario consistent with the natural environment and what was known about his daily habits. This conclusion was not absolute or definitive, because the lack of a body always leaves a gap, but it was sufficient to serve as the basis for subsequent administrative and investigative decisions. According to standard procedure, when a missing person case no longer produces new leads after a certain period and has been assessed as most likely an accident, the file is reclassified as a cold case. That does not mean the matter is completely closed. It means it is no longer handled as an active daily search operation. Simon's file was archived alongside similar cases, complete with all reports, search maps, dive logs, and related data, ready to be reopened if new information emerges. For the family, this transition carried a far heavier meaning than any administrative term it marked. The moment when active searching officially ended, and the hope of finding Simon alive gradually grew faint. However, from the perspective of the investigating agency, it was a necessary step given limited resources and the absence of any new factors to justify continuing an expanded search. From the point the file was classified as a cold case, active investigation was officially paused, all search teams were fully withdrawn, and the case was maintained only at the level of receiving and evaluating any new information if credible leads were provided. Any future calls, reports, or discoveries related to Simon Barret would be documented and assessed, but no large-scale search plans would be maintained. Lake Tahoe gradually returned to its everyday rhythm. The boat ramp continued to welcome other fishermen, while Simon's disappearance quietly slipped into a cold case drawer where unanswered questions still lingered but were no longer actively pursued. 8 months after Simon Barrett's missing person file was moved to archive status, one late winter afternoon at the Carson City police station unfolded like hundreds of other afternoons, slow-paced work, no emergency incidents recorded until a man appeared at the main entrance in a condition that immediately caught the attention of the on-duty staff. The man walked slowly, his frame so gaunt that his oversized coat hung loosely on his body. His face hollow with ashen, pale skin like someone who had endured a long period of malnutrition and lack of medical care. When asked to stop for an initial check, the man appeared confused, reacted slowly, his gaze unfocused, and it took him several seconds to answer even simple questions. He was unable to produce any form of identification, had no wallet, no phone, and no personal belongings except for an old canvas bag that he clutched tightly in his right hand as if it were something he could not let go of. During the initial intake process, the desk officer realized that the man identified himself as Simon Barret, a name that was immediately cross-checked against the active missing persons database in the system. Once the match was confirmed, the atmosphere in the reception area changed noticeably, because the man standing before them was the individual who had been documented as missing for many months, a case that had once been worked and later placed in the no-progress file category. Simon's physical condition at that time was recorded in detail: significant weight loss compared to old medical records, visibly atrophied muscles throughout his body, unsteady posture, and clear signs of prolonged exhaustion, indicating that he had not merely endured a recent short, difficult journey, but a long period of living under severely deprived conditions. During the preliminary examination, medical personnel were called in to assess his emergency status, and it was at this moment that one serious detail became glaringly obvious and impossible to overlook. Simon's left hand was missing the middle finger and the ring finger. The stumps were fully healed over with skin, showing no signs of recent bleeding, which meant the injury had not occurred recently, but had existed long enough for the body to heal at a basic level. The loss of the 2 fingers was not accompanied by any bandages or medical support devices, nor were there indications of a typical work-related accident, causing this injury to be immediately documented as an abnormal factor that required clarification. When asked about personal identification, Simon shook his head and offered no clear explanation, only continuing to grip the canvas bag he had carried in from the moment he entered the station. The bag appeared to have been in use for a very long time, its surface worn and torn, straps frayed, carrying an old musty smell, along with accumulated dirt and dust completely inconsistent with a short trip or a momentary accident. During the security check, the bag was requested to be set down for safety reasons, and although Simon reacted slowly, he clearly did not want to let go of it, a detail that was noted in the intake report as behavior requiring attention. No identifying items were found inside the bag at that time. It was only determined that this was not the type of bag Simon typically used in his fishing activities, according to earlier descriptions from his family and acquaintances. Given his alarming physical condition, Simon was moved to the medical area for a more thorough evaluation, while investigators began carrying out the necessary verification steps to confirm his identity. The entire intake process was carefully documented from the moment Simon entered the police station, his initial condition, to the unusual details surrounding the injury and his behavior. Simon Barret's reappearance in such a state forced the authorities to reevaluate the entire archived file, because the reality standing before them clearly did not align with the preliminary conclusion that had previously been reached. The fact that a person presumed to have suffered a water accident and gone missing had now returned with serious injuries, no identification, in a state of prolonged emaciation, and carrying an item of unknown origin meant the case could no longer be considered within the old framework. Per protocol, Simon's file was pulled from the archived list, returned to active status, and a new investigative approach was established to reflect what had just been documented at the Carson City police station. No assumptions were imposed at that moment, but the event was sufficient to determine that Simon Barret's case could no longer be handled as an ordinary missing person incident or an environmental accident, and it needed to be re-examined based on the new data arising directly from his sudden and highly unusual return. After Simon Barret was admitted and transferred to the medical observation area, identity confirmation procedures were carried out simultaneously with efforts to stabilize his physical condition, because although the system had already shown a name match with a missing person file, protocol required concrete proof before any official conclusion could be drawn. A DNA sample was collected according to standard procedure, processed on a priority basis, and compared against the archived data from Simon's previous medical records. At the same time, his dental records were retrieved for comparison with his current dental structure, including features that had been documented during routine checkups before he disappeared. The comparison process was conducted carefully and without haste, since the injuries and prolonged emaciation could alter certain superficial indicators, but the core biological markers still allowed for reliable identification. The results of these analyses showed an exact match with Simon Barret's records, ruling out any possibility of mistaken identity or impersonation, and officially confirmed that the man who appeared at the Carson City police station was indeed the individual documented as missing many months earlier. In parallel with the DNA and dental verification, investigators compared Simon's pre-disappearance medical records with his current condition. Data on height, weight, medical history, and other biological characteristics were reviewed to assess the extent of changes during the period he was missing. The severe weight loss, state of malnutrition, and signs of physical deterioration were inconsistent with a short trip or a momentary accident, but entirely consistent with Simon having spent a prolonged period under conditions of deprivation and without medical care. Once Simon's identity was technically confirmed, his family was contacted in accordance with protocol, and an in-person identification took place under controlled conditions with medical staff and investigators present. The family confirmed that the man standing before them was Simon Barret, based on unmistakable traits such as his voice, facial features, and other familiar personal markers, even though they acknowledged that his appearance and demeanor had changed significantly compared to their earlier memories. The family's confirmation concluded the identification phase, while simultaneously opening a new series of observations related to Simon's behavior and responses after his return. In the initial contacts, Simon displayed clear reticence, slow reactions to simple questions, prolonged avoidance of eye contact, and a tendency to shrink back when the surrounding space became crowded. These changes were documented in detail in the reports, because they stood in stark contrast to earlier descriptions of a man accustomed to the collective working environment at the marina and who had no difficulty with social interaction. Investigators also noted that Simon frequently clenched his right hand, especially when the canvas bag was nearby, and showed signs of tension when asked to temporarily part with the item, a reaction disproportionate to the bag's apparent external value, but clear enough to be recorded as behavioral evidence requiring further analysis. While the identity confirmation procedures were being finalized, the bag Simon had carried with him since arriving at the police station was handled according to protocol for unidentified evidence. It was sealed, assigned an identification code, and entered into the chain of custody log for items pending forensic examination, with full documentation of the time of seizure, external condition, and the carrier's reaction when separated from it. Sealing the bag did not come with any conclusions about its role in the case at that stage, but it was done to ensure that every element connected to Simon's reappearance was preserved in its original state for later evaluation. The entire sequence of identity confirmation steps from DNA analysis, dental and medical record comparison, to direct family confirmation and post-return behavioral observations was completed in a continuous, controlled chain of procedures. When this process concluded, there remained no doubt that the emaciated man who appeared in Carson City was Simon Barret, the same person who had vanished from Lake Tahoe many months earlier. However, along with certainty about his identity, the stark differences between the man he once was and his current state were also fully documented, forming a new, independent set of data separate from previous assumptions and laying the foundation for how the authorities would now approach the case based on what had been objectively confirmed. The medical evaluation of Simon Barret was conducted in a comprehensive and extended manner, not only to determine his immediate emergency status, but also to reconstruct the picture of his physical condition throughout the period he was missing, through biological indicators, signs of injury, and the degree of functional decline. Doctors recorded severe malnutrition, evidenced by a drastic reduction in body fat percentage, clearly visible muscle atrophy in the shoulders, thighs, and forearms, along with biochemical markers showing prolonged deficiencies in protein, vitamins, and minerals, not the result of a few days or weeks of inadequate intake, but reflective of a period of many months during which the body was not supplied with sufficient energy and nutrients. The analyses indicated that the malnutrition process had followed a chronic pattern, with survival adaptation signs such as slowed heart rate, lower than average body temperature, and suppressed metabolic reflexes, features that typically appear only in cases of long-term living under severe food restriction. Alongside that, periodic dehydration was also identified through mild kidney damage and electrolyte imbalances, indicating that Simon had not had consistent access to a stable and safe water source over an extended time. The next focus of the medical evaluation centered on the injury to his left hand, where Simon was missing the middle finger and the ring finger. Diagnostic imaging and scar tissue examination showed that the two fingers had been amputated along a relatively clean line, inconsistent with the kinds of accidents commonly encountered in a fishing environment, such as getting caught in machinery, blunt impact, or uncontrolled cuts from sharp equipment. The scar edges displayed natural skin healing without signs of professional surgical intervention, yet they also lacked the characteristics of a random, ragged, traumatic injury. This ruled out the possibility that the injury occurred during a typical work accident or ordinary environmental mishap, while at the same time indicating that the amputation had been carried out deliberately and without proper subsequent medical care. Doctors also noted the absence of any acute infection at the amputation site, an outcome possible only when the body was forced to adapt on its own in conditions lacking antibiotics and medical care, carrying a high risk of complications yet still resulting in survival. When assessing the overall signs across Simon's body, the medical team identified the presence of multiple other minor injuries, including old scars on the back, arms, and legs, varying in age of formation, indicating that these injuries had not occurred all at once, but were scattered across a prolonged period. These scars did not bear the characteristics of ordinary everyday accidents. Instead, they were more consistent with repeated impacts, lack of proper care conditions, and failure to receive appropriate medical treatment. In addition, signs such as chronic skin inflammation, fungal infections on the feet and nails, along with rapid deterioration of oral health, reinforced the conclusion that Simon had not had access to basic hygiene conditions for an extended time. To further clarify the nature of this physical state, doctors compared Simon's current data with his medical records from before he went missing, including weight, body measurements, physical endurance, and medical history. The differences between the two periods were stark and could not be explained by the hypothesis of someone voluntarily abandoning their former life to wander or survive off the grid. In cases of voluntary disappearance, even under difficult living conditions, individuals typically manage to maintain at least minimal nutrition, access to food, drinking water, and basic medical support, especially in populated areas of the western United States. Simon's state of extreme emaciation, combined with deliberate injuries and the absence of signs of self-care, did not fit that pattern. On the contrary, it reflected a situation in which autonomy over basic needs was severely restricted, and access to food, water, and medical care was entirely dependent on external factors. From a medical perspective, the doctors reached a consensus that there were no indicators suggesting Simon had actively chosen a lifestyle leading to his current condition, nor was there evidence of a single accident severe enough to account for the full range of documented injuries. Instead, the medical data pointed to a pattern of prolonged, systematic harm, occurring in an environment that did not allow the individual to protect or care for themselves. A preliminary conclusion, based on the comprehensive evaluation, was that Simon Barret's physical condition was consistent with having been held captive for an extended period and subjected to forms of physical abuse and living conditions severe enough to cause chronic malnutrition, deliberate injuries, and widespread functional decline. This conclusion was not based on subjective speculation but was built from specific medical evidence, closely cross-referenced with Simon's prior records, and after systematically ruling out alternative hypotheses, such as a single accident or voluntary disappearance, forming an independent objective assessment of what his body had endured during the time he was missing. In parallel with the medical evaluation, the psychological assessment of Simon Barret was conducted according to standard clinical protocols for individuals returning after a prolonged period of disappearance, focusing on cognitive function, memory, and orientation ability rather than extracting detailed narratives. Psychologists began by testing short-term and long-term memory through neutral questions about personal information, familiar time markers, and events prior to Simon leaving Lake Tahoe. They recorded that he was able to answer accurately and consistently on content related to his earlier life, indicating that foundational memory remained intact. However, when the tests shifted to temporal orientation, Simon showed clear difficulty in determining the amount of time that had passed since he went missing. He was unable to reliably estimate days, weeks, or months, and his responses fluctuated, revealing a disruption in his perception of continuous time. Assessments of attention and information processing showed that Simon maintained basic cognitive awareness, but his response speed was slow, requiring significantly more time to handle complex requests, especially those involving sequential questions or chronological recall. When the experts began asking questions directly related to the period of his disappearance, avoidance behaviors became clear and consistent. Simon tended to give brief answers, redirect the topic, or completely stop responding when questions touched on the time he could not explain through familiar reference points. There were no signs that he was deliberately fabricating or contradicting himself, but the avoidance followed a repeated pattern, suggesting that memories related to that period were not easily accessible or processed by the brain in a typical way. The experts noted that during these moments, Simon frequently exhibited accompanying physiological reactions, such as increased breathing rate, tension in the shoulders and neck, and unfocused gaze, indicating activation of a stress response rather than mere hesitation in answering. Another notable point emerged when the assessment environment unintentionally triggered spatial cues. When placed in smaller rooms with fewer windows or closed doors, Simon displayed pronounced stress responses, including frequent shifts in posture, difficulty maintaining eye contact, and requests to open the door or move to a different space. These reactions did not appear when he was in open, well-ventilated areas or spaces with clearly visible exits, indicating a direct link between the sensation of spatial confinement and anxiety responses. Subsequent assessments using neutral stimuli related to enclosed spaces such as images or descriptions of narrow areas produced similar physiological reactions, reinforcing the conclusion that this was not a fleeting situational response, but an established pattern. Based on clinical diagnostic criteria, the experts evaluated the degree of post-traumatic stress disorder, considering the presence of symptoms such as avoidance of memories, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and exaggerated stress responses. Simon met many of these criteria, particularly those related to avoidance and stress activation when exposed to cues tied to uncontrollable experiences. No signs of psychosis, hallucinations, or loss of contact with reality were observed, indicating that Simon's psychological state remained grounded in reality and fell within the framework of a trauma response. The experts also assessed organized recall ability, the capacity to recount events in a coherent chronological sequence, and found that for the period before his disappearance, Simon could present information clearly, whereas for the time he was missing, his account became fragmented, lacking connecting markers and non-linear. This was not interpreted as a sign of dishonesty, but was consistent with patterns observed in individuals who have endured prolonged trauma, where memories are not stored as a continuous sequence but are fragmented by sensation and survival responses. From a professional standpoint, the experts concluded that Simon's statements, particularly those concerning the period of his disappearance, were likely to be incomplete and unable to be presented in a stable, linear sequence, not due to lack of cooperation but due to real psychological limitations. Documenting this finding carries significant weight in how information from Simon is approached, because it establishes that all data obtained from him must be placed within the context of psychological trauma, with the understanding that memories may emerge in disjointed fragments, out of chronological order, and can only be accessed in a limited way when related triggers do not exceed the nervous system's tolerance threshold. The conclusions from this psychological evaluation were compiled into a separate report, supplementing the prior medical assessment, to provide a scientific foundation for understanding Simon Barret's mental state, as well as the objective limitations in his ability to recall and articulate his experiences. The analysis of the bag that Simon Barret carried with him when he appeared at the police station was conducted according to standard evidence examination procedures, completely separated from the medical and psychological evaluations to ensure the objectivity of the collected data. Right from the initial step, forensic experts focused on identifying the material composition of the bag, noting that it was not the type of bag commonly used in fishing activities or typical outdoor living around the Lake Tahoe area. The thick fabric structure, high-durability synthetic fibers, and reinforced stitching at stress points indicated that the bag had been manufactured for prolonged use in harsh conditions, yet it did not bear the characteristics of any familiar brands or suppliers found in local stores. Through examination of remaining labels and stitching patterns, the experts determined that the bag's production origin belonged to a small manufacturer specializing in outdoor gear for a different market region, with no widespread distribution network in Northern California or Nevada. This significantly reduced the likelihood that Simon had purchased or used it in his daily life before going missing. Next, the bag's state of wear was evaluated in detail, including fraying of the straps, scratches on the bottom, crude patches, and the accumulation of old dirt, dust, and sweat embedded in the inner fabric layers. These signs indicated that the bag had been in continuous use for a period far exceeding the 8 months since Simon disappeared, and it was inconsistent with the idea that it had only been carried during a short phase immediately before he appeared at the station. Samples of dust and debris collected from inside the bag revealed the presence of multiple different environments, including dry soil, plant fibers, and organic traces that did not match the lakeside area where Simon normally operated, reinforcing the conclusion that the bag had traveled through various locations and had been used in conditions unrelated to his previous life. The inventory of items inside the bag was carried out with care. Each item was documented, photographed, and individually sealed. These items consisted of basic personal effects, such as scraps of cloth, cordage, rudimentary tools, and a few small objects for daily survival. But none of them could be directly linked to Simon through personal records, living habits, or confirmation from family. None of the items bore any personal identifiers of Simon, such as his name, familiar markings, or gear he had used in his fishing profession. The variety and nature of these items suggested that the bag had not been prepared for any one specific person, and may have been used interchangeably or served multiple purposes in an informal setting. During deeper forensic examination, biological samples were collected from the surface and interior of the items inside the bag, including strands of hair, skin fragments, and dried fluids, and sent for DNA analysis. The results showed that in addition to biological traces belonging to Simon, there were also DNA samples that did not match his profile and could not be explained by incidental contact in a public environment. These samples were found in positions indicating prolonged and repeated contact, such as the inner side of the straps and the bottom of the bag areas that frequently touched the user's body. The discovery of DNA not belonging to Simon, combined with the bag's state of wear and incompatible production origin, ruled out the possibility that the bag was merely something Simon had picked up or borrowed temporarily for a short period. Instead, it was determined to be an item that had been associated with a long-term process of use, likely involving other individuals besides Simon. Forensic experts also noted that there were no signs the bag had ever been systematically cleaned or had its contents replaced, indicating it had not been managed as ordinary personal property, but had existed in conditions lacking basic control and hygiene. All of these findings were compiled into a detailed forensic report in which the bag was not merely described as an item Simon carried when he reappeared, but was identified as an independent source of data containing information about the environments, time periods, and people Simon had come into contact with during his absence. On that basis, the bag was officially classified as a central piece of evidence in the case not because of any material value, but because it provided an objective set of clues independent of Simon's memory or statements. Establishing this central role meant that every subsequent investigative step related to the period of Simon's disappearance had to be considered and cross-referenced against what the bag revealed from its origin, signs of use, to the biological samples found within it, because in a context where verbal accounts may be limited by psychological trauma, the bag became one of the rare elements capable of passively recording what had occurred without being influenced by human perception. In the tightly controlled psychological and information extraction-paced sessions, Simon Barret gradually presented what he could recall about how he was approached before disappearing, not as a seamless story, but as a sequence of disjointed sensations, images, and actions that were pieced together through repeated cross-referencing and confirmation. Simon described that, on that day, while on the surface of Lake Tahoe during his usual time frame, everything initially unfolded exactly as it did in his everyday routine. Calm water, good visibility, and no unusual elements that would have put him on alert. He noticed a man appear at a moderate distance, not rushing in abruptly, operating a small vessel that approached in a calm and controlled manner. The man did not shout, show haste, or act aggressively. Instead, he signaled with simple gestures accompanied by an offer of assistance related to a technical issue presented as a common occurrence. According to Simon, the man's body language matched that of someone genuinely in trouble. There were no threatening or coercive signs, and the context on the open water, where mutual assistance is a familiar practice, made him feel no need to maintain distance. Simon explained that over many years of commercial fishing, he had both given and received help in similar situations. So responding to a distress signal was not an unusual decision. When he maneuvered his boat closer to communicate, the approach still maintained an appearance of cooperation, with enough distance to talk without creating a sense of intrusion. It was at this precise moment, according to Simon, that he began to sense a subtle but unidentifiable shift, as though the pace of the situation was being controlled by the other person. Simon did not describe a brutal or chaotic attack, but rather a very rapid feeling of losing control, happening before he could fully register the danger. He remembered that his body no longer responded to his will. His balance was affected, and his awareness became clouded for a brief but sufficient period that prevented him from resisting or escaping the situation. Simon could not precisely identify the tool or method used to subdue him. He only noted that it was not a random or impulsive act, but one carried out in a clean, orderly sequence, as though the other person had already prepared for the victim's reactions. In his account, Simon emphasized that the most memorable moment was not physical pain, but the realization that he no longer had any decision-making power, that every subsequent action was beyond his control. After that point, his memories became fragmented, lacking a clear chronological order, yet still retaining core sensations such as passivity, disorientation, and complete dependence on the actions of others. Simon could not specifically describe being transferred onto any particular vessel, nor could he explain what happened to his own boat, because his awareness during that phase did not allow him to fully register spatial details. He only knew that when minimal awareness returned, he was no longer on the familiar water, could no longer hear the characteristic sounds of the lake, and had no signs that would allow him to determine direction or distance traveled. Simon also could not determine the amount of time that passed between being subdued and regaining awareness of the new environment, because his sense of time during that period was compressed and discontinuous, consistent with what had been documented in the prior psychological evaluation. Nevertheless, the core elements of his account were presented consistently across multiple sessions, particularly the initial approach based on feigned need for help, the rapid shift from normal interaction to a state of being overpowered, and the fact that he was removed from Lake Tahoe without consent or any ability to decide for himself. Simon described no voluntary choices at any point in this sequence of events, nor did he recall agreeing to follow the man for any personal reason or benefit. Instead, the entire experience was presented as a process in which initial trust was exploited to create a window of reaction time enough for the approaching individual to impose control. Investigators noted that although the statement was technically incomplete and unable to provide a route or vehicle details, the behavioral structure described was consistent with a deliberate scenario in which approach, trust building, subduing, and victim transport were executed in a sequence designed to minimize attention and resistance. From a content perspective, Simon's account clearly established that his disappearance did not originate from an accident or a personal decision, but from a calculated act of coercion, in which his freedom was taken away through manipulative approach and control imposed against the victim's will. The process of identifying the perpetrator was carried out by synthesizing the data collected from Simon's statement, the central piece of evidence, and available criminal records, leading investigators to narrow down to a subject who matched the established behavioral pattern. Scott Pritchard emerged during the review as an individual with a serious history of violence, having appeared in multiple investigative files related to homicides and disappearances across several western U.S. states. Pritchard's background showed he had the ability to move freely across state lines, did not maintain a fixed residence for extended periods, and had held various temporary jobs connected to outdoor environments and watercraft conditions that facilitated approaching victims in open spaces without drawing attention. Investigators noted that in earlier cases linked to Pritchard, the initial crime pattern was direct and quick to conclude, with victims killed shortly after contact, often leaving few clear pieces of evidence beyond hard-to-trace traces. However, when the cases were rearranged in chronological order, a noticeable shift in behavior began to appear. Later incidents no longer focused on rapid commission of the crime, but showed a trend toward prolonging control over the victim, with large gaps between the time of disappearance and the discovery of a body or, in some cases, no body ever being found. This analysis revealed an evolutionary process in how Pritchard carried out his offenses, moving from seeking immediate outcomes to extending the criminal experience itself. Behavioral experts consulted concluded that this change did not stem from a greater need to conceal the crime, but from a shift in the perpetrator's psychological motivation. Instead of viewing murder as the ultimate goal, Pritchard gradually moved toward controlling and maintaining the victim's state of dependency over an extended period, treating that process as an experience to be experimented with and refined. Pritchard's psychological profile, built from previous interrogations and statements from people who had interacted with him, indicated a tendency to seek stimulation through observing gradual human deterioration not as an instant thrill of control, but as a prolonged process, where each passing day brought a new sensation. This motivation was clearly identified as a desire to experiment with slow torture, witnessing the physical and mental changes in the victim over time, rather than killing immediately, as in earlier cases. When this motive was compared with Simon Barret's case, the parallels became clear and consistent. Simon was a man who lived a structured life, had few complicated relationships, and frequently operated alone in open yet isolated spaces, especially on the water, where an approach based on a need for help was entirely plausible and unlikely to raise suspicion. Records showed Simon had no history of conflict, no excessive risk-taking behavior, and his initial disappearance could easily be explained as an environmental accident, aligning precisely with the victim selection criteria Pritchard had targeted in previous cases. Simon's good physical condition before going missing, his familiarity with heavy labor and outdoor survival, also fit the profile of a target for a perpetrator who wanted to extend the period of captivity and test the endurance of his prey over time. Investigators noted that Simon was not killed immediately but was kept in a state of prolonged emaciation, gradually losing physical function and sustaining deliberate injuries, reflecting exactly the shift in crime pattern identified in Pritchard's record. When these details were placed side by side, they did more than identify the perpetrator at an individual level. They allowed the construction of a complete picture of the method and motive being applied in this case. Combining Pritchard's prior homicide record with the current behavioral and motivational analysis created a continuous logical chain in which Simon Barret was not a random victim, but the result of a deliberate selection process based on accessibility, degree of isolation, and the potential to sustain the victim's life over an extended period. On that basis, Scott Pritchard was identified as the primary focus of the ongoing investigation. With all the connecting elements in place: prior criminal history, evolving behavioral pattern over time, psychological motivation, and specific fit with the circumstances of Simon Barret's case. The process of identifying the confinement location was carried out by synthesizing indirect data collected from Simon's fragmented statements, the results of evidence examination, and analysis of the suspect's behavioral patterns, thereby narrowing down to a remote area within the Sierra Nevada range that matched all the recorded facts. Investigators focused on regions lying outside the main tourist routes, sparsely populated, with complex terrain and limited accessibility, where an individual could maintain a presence for an extended period without being detected. The identified area was not a single, easily recognizable fixed point, but a broad region featuring narrow valleys, steep mountain slopes, dense forest, and seldom used dirt roads, creating multiple natural layers of separation between the confinement space and the outside world. The terrain characteristics here were assessed as posing serious obstacles to escape, not because of artificial barriers such as fences or locked doors, but due to the combination of elevation, steep inclines, harsh weather, and great distance to any populated areas. Trails in this area were often unmarked, easily obscured by vegetation, and subject to seasonal changes, making orientation nearly impossible for someone unfamiliar with the landscape. In particular, the large day-night temperature swings, along with prolonged snowfall over many months, created an environment where movement without adequate preparation would quickly lead to exhaustion or life-threatening danger. When analyzing the features of the confinement space, investigators noted the absence of any signs of traditional imprisonment structures with clear physical barriers. The space was described as an open area, possibly a rudimentary cabin, a makeshift structure, or a natural site that had been utilized where the victim was not locked behind a bolted door or secured with fixed chains. The lack of obvious physical barriers did not reduce the effectiveness of control. On the contrary, it pointed to a form of confinement that fully exploited environmental factors. Experts concluded that in such a space, the terrain and natural conditions themselves served as invisible walls, making departure extremely risky, especially for someone in a state of emaciation and lacking navigational information. Evaluation of living conditions at the site revealed the bare minimum necessary to sustain life over a long period, but insufficient to allow recovery or improvement of health. The collected indicators showed that the victim may have been provided with just enough food and water to prevent rapid death, but suffered severe deficiencies in nutrition, hygiene, and medical care. There was no evidence that the space was designed for comfort or safety. It only met the requirement of keeping the victim in a state of prolonged survival. Poor sanitary conditions, unreliable access to clean water, and constant exposure to cold weather were seen as direct contributing factors to the chronic malnutrition and physical damage documented in Simon. When analyzing the feasibility of victim control in the absence of chains or locked doors, investigators and behavioral experts focused on psychological and survival factors. An individual brought to a remote, unfamiliar area in a weakened physical state and without means of communication would face a high risk of death if they attempted to leave without preparation. Fear of the surrounding environment, combined with dependence on the minimal supplies provided by the controller, created an effective state of captivity without the need for continuous physical restraint. Experts also noted that the absence of chains or visible barriers could be part of the perpetrator's behavioral pattern, aimed at maintaining a more subtle sense of control where the victim perceives they are free to move, yet in reality has no safe option to escape. From an investigative perspective, this confinement space was regarded as a key element in understanding how Simon was held for such a long time without leaving clear traces, while also explaining why he was able to survive under harsh conditions. The narrowing down of the remote area in the Sierra Nevada, together with the analysis of terrain, living conditions, and a control mechanism not reliant on physical barriers, provided a logical picture of how a victim could be effectively confined in an open environment where nature itself became the tool of captivity, replacing the traditional forms of imprisonment commonly encountered in criminal investigations. The reconstruction of the confinement process was carried out by combining Simon's fragmented statements, the medical evaluation, the psychological assessment, and analysis of the perpetrator's behavioral patterns, revealing that this was not a series of impulsive actions, but a deliberately maintained system of control over time. First, the control of food and water was identified as the foundation of the entire confinement process, with the victim granted access only to minimal amounts on an irregular, unpredictable cycle enough to sustain life but insufficient to restore physical strength. This cycle did not follow a regular schedule, making it impossible for Simon to anticipate when food or water would be provided, thereby undermining his ability to regulate his own biological rhythms and increasing his level of dependence on the controller. Doctors noted that the pattern of Simon's malnutrition matched a model of intermittent energy supply, where the body was repeatedly pushed into deficit and then temporarily compensated, creating a prolonged loop of exhaustion. In parallel with nutritional control, sleep and light were also used as tools to disrupt cognition. Simon described being unable to clearly distinguish day from night during many periods, with light restricted or altered irregularly, combined with instances of being awakened at unpredictable times. Experts concluded that long-term disruption of the natural sleep-wake cycle would impair time orientation, reduce psychological resilience, and make the victim more prone to a passive state. This aligned with the documented difficulties in temporal orientation from Simon's psychological evaluation, where he was unable to reliably estimate the length of the confinement period. The next element in the confinement process was the near absolute restriction of communication and social contact. Simon did not recall the regular presence of other people, nor did he have opportunities for exchange or interaction beyond the minimal contacts necessary to maintain control. This prolonged isolation was assessed as having a profound impact on mental state, as it removed all social anchors and prevented reality testing through others. Behavioral experts noted that isolation does not need to be total to be effective. It only needs to be sufficient to prevent the victim from forming any sense of community or support, thereby intensifying psychological dependence. Within that context, physical punishments were applied, not randomly or impulsively, but as controlled experimental steps. These interventions did not occur continuously, but appeared at deliberate intervals enough to generate sustained fear rather than immediate pain. Medical analysis showed that the injuries on Simon's body were consistent with this pattern. The wounds were not simultaneous, showed no signs of a single violent episode, and instead reflected multiple separate impacts distributed over time. Experts stated that this approach allowed the perpetrator to observe the victim's reactions, adjust the level of impact, and extend the period of confinement without causing premature death. Within that escalation sequence, the amputation of Simon's fingers was identified as a significant transitional step not only physically but also psychologically. This act was not carried out in a chaotic or impulsive context, but was recorded as calculated, occurring after the victim had already been in a state of prolonged emaciation. From a behavioral analysis perspective, this was a sign that the perpetrator had moved from an initial experimental phase to a higher level of control, using irreversible injury as a means of asserting power and completely shattering the victim's sense of safety. Doctors noted that the injury received no proper medical treatment, yet it was not intended to cause death, indicating the goal was not to end life but to maintain a state of prolonged pain and dependency. The choice of fingers rather than other body parts was also assessed as both symbolic and practical. It caused clear functional impairment without immediately threatening life, while leaving a permanent mark both physically and mentally. When all these elements were synthesized, the confinement process emerged as a multi-layered system of control, in which food, water, sleep, light, social interaction, and physical punishment were deliberately combined to sustain the victim's life in a state of emaciation and dependence. None of the elements in this process were random. Each component played a specific role in weakening resistance and prolonging the experience the perpetrator sought. From an investigative standpoint, reconstructing this confinement process not only explained Simon's physical and psychological condition upon return, but also reinforced the conclusion that what occurred was not temporary or impulsive captivity, but a structured process that was maintained and adjusted over time with the objective of testing the limits of human endurance. The discovery of biological traces not belonging to Simon inside the bag opened up an entirely new direction of analysis, focusing on the possibility that the bag had previously been associated with other individuals before coming into Simon's possession. DNA samples were extracted from various locations within the bag, including the inner side of the straps, fabric folds with minimal exposure to the external environment, and the surfaces of several small items inside, and processed separately to prevent cross-contamination. The results revealed the presence of multiple distinct genetic profiles, some of which did not match anyone in Simon's personal records or individuals who had legally come into contact with the evidence. When these samples were cross-referenced with state and federal missing persons databases, several partial matches appeared not sufficient to identify specific individuals, but enough to indicate connections to existing unsolved cases that had remained open for years. These DNA samples did not appear in positions prone to random incidental transfer. Instead, they were concentrated in areas showing repeated and prolonged contact, suggesting that the individuals carrying those biological traces had used or carried the bag for a significant period of time. This analysis led to the hypothesis that the bag was not the personal item of a single victim, but may have been used interchangeably in a prolonged series of confinements, serving as a minimal survival tool passed from one person to another. When this hypothesis was placed alongside the already reconstructed confinement model, the possibility of multiple victims prior to Simon became both plausible and deeply concerning. Unsolved missing persons files in the Sierra Nevada region and neighboring states were re-examined, particularly those sharing common features: disappearances in remote environments, no initial signs of violence at the scene, and cases preliminarily explained as accidents or voluntary departures. Several files within this group showed striking similarities in timing, location, and victim characteristics, including individuals who led stable lives, had few personal conflicts, and frequently operated alone in open but isolated spaces. Cross-referencing these files with the unidentified DNA samples from the bag indicated a high likelihood that at least some of those individuals had direct contact with the evidence, although the exact sequence of events or final outcomes for each case could not yet be confirmed. The absence of bodies in many of those prior missing persons cases, which had previously been attributed to the harsh natural environment, was now reconsidered from a different perspective. The lack of physical remains did not necessarily mean no coercive act had occurred. As these pieces of information were synthesized, the picture that emerged was no longer that of an isolated incident, but the potential existence of a repeated pattern of behavior in which victims were selected, approached, and controlled according to consistent criteria. The expanded review was not limited to areas geographically close to Lake Tahoe, but included other regions with similar terrain features and access conditions, places where disappearances had previously been quickly classified due to the lack of clear criminal evidence. These files were re-evaluated with a new focus, paying attention to details once considered insignificant: victims not carrying full personal belongings, the appearance of unidentified items during searches, or unusual gaps in the timeline leading up to the disappearance. When these elements were compared with the biological traces and the established confinement model, the possibility of multiple prior victims no longer seemed far-fetched, but became a well-supported investigative direction. In this context, the bag was viewed as a connective piece of evidence, not only linked to Simon, but potentially a point of intersection for multiple untold stories. Each unidentified DNA sample represented an individual who may have gone through a similar process, with an unclear outcome, and the fact that they coexisted on a single item suggested systematic repetition rather than random coincidence. Expanding the review to similar cases also meant revisiting how past missing persons files had been classified and concluded, especially those closed under the assumption of environmental accidents. Simon's reappearance after many months missing, in his particular physical and psychological condition, became a vivid point of comparison, showing that an alternative scenario could have played out in similar cases where no one returned to tell the story. When all these facts were placed side by side, indications of other victims no longer rested on a single detail, but on the convergence of multiple factors: unidentified biological traces, unsolved missing persons files, similarities in disappearance circumstances, and the presence of a recurring piece of evidence. These elements formed a network of clues, suggesting that Simon's case might be only one part of a longer chain, one in which multiple individuals had been subjected to the same confinement process, with varying degrees of control and outcomes, but all leaving silent traces that only began to become visible as pieces of the same picture once the bag was thoroughly analyzed. Simon Barret's escape took shape through a long chain of quiet observations, not through recklessness or open resistance, but through adapting to the rhythm of control that had been imposed on his life. During his confinement, Simon realized that control was not applied continuously at the same intensity. Instead, small gaps appeared cyclically, often tied to moments of complacency on the part of his captor, who believed the surrounding environment was dangerous enough to deter any attempt to leave. Rather than seeking ways to fight back, Simon chose to feign complete compliance with the daily rules, accepting the restrictions on food, water, and space, and maintaining the image of someone who was utterly exhausted, minimally responsive, and no longer capable of independent decisions. He deliberately slowed his reflexes, limited communication, and avoided any behavior that could be interpreted as defiance, because he understood that drawing attention would only lead to tighter control or harsher punishments. In that state of apparent compliance, Simon devoted most of his remaining energy to observing and memorizing small details in the surrounding environment. The rhythm of his captor's appearances, changes in natural light, and periods when the space became noticeably quieter. Over time, he recognized that the bag was always present in the confinement area and was not treated as an object requiring strict oversight, likely because it had existed there long before and was not considered a threat. Simon gradually came to understand that if he ever managed to leave, the bag would be the only means allowing him to carry the minimal items necessary for survival outside, since he had no opportunity to prepare anything else. When a period of looser supervision appeared, not a complete absence, but a phase lacking direct observation, Simon decided to act in the least noticeable way possible. He approached the bag as though it were part of an established routine, carrying it without any hurried or secretive gestures, keeping his pace of movement similar to previous instances to avoid creating any detectable difference. Leaving the confinement space did not happen through a panicked run, but through slow, cautious steps that matched his prolonged state of physical exhaustion. Simon was fully aware that his body no longer had the strength for quick movements or reckless decisions, especially in treacherous terrain, where a single slip or complete depletion of energy could lead to irreversible consequences. He chose to move continuously at a low pace, prioritizing stability over speed, avoiding steep slopes, areas prone to loss of balance, and places that would drain energy too rapidly. Throughout that process, the bag became the central element not only because of the items inside, but because it allowed Simon to keep everything essential within a single, controlled range, reducing the need to stop or turn back to search. The sensations of pain and exhaustion never left him during the journey. Dizziness, trembling, and constant aching appeared repeatedly, but Simon understood that stopping meant risking the inability to continue moving. He had no accurate sense of direction, no clear knowledge of where he was heading. He relied solely on the single principle of continuing to move farther away from the confinement area until the surrounding environment changed noticeably. Reaching an area with human presence did not happen immediately. It was a gradual process in which every small sign of human activity, clearer trail markings, the distant sound of vehicles, or changes in the landscape became motivation to keep moving, even when his body was nearing its limit. Simon did not seek help at the first sign of humans, because his psychological state was still dominated by caution and fear of being discovered, but the familiar elements of human life were enough to confirm that he had left the zone of direct control. Throughout that journey, the bag never left his side, not because of its material value, but because it represented the only continuity between the time of his captivity and the moment he began returning to the outside world. When pieced together from Simon's account, the escape process emerges as a series of cautious, calculated actions carried out under extreme conditions where survival did not depend on strength or speed, but on the ability to observe, feign compliance to reduce attention, choose the right moment, and maintain the will to keep moving despite severe physical depletion. The tracing process was carried out by placing Simon Barret's statement side by side with all the collected physical evidence, without treating any single source of information as absolutely central, but instead seeking logical intersections between them. Simon's fragmented descriptions of the terrain surrounding the place of confinement, including the sensation of steep slopes, unstable ground, prolonged cold air, and a clear shift between dense forest and barren open spaces, were compared against the soil, dust, and plant fiber samples collected from the bag. Geological analysis showed that the mineral composition of the soil adhering to the bottom of the bag matched areas of high elevation within the Sierra Nevada range, where exposed granite bedrock alternates with nutrient-poor forest soil. The dry plant fibers, which did not belong to the lakeside ecosystem, indicated long-term presence in a high mountain environment, reinforcing the conclusion that the confinement space was located a significant distance from Lake Tahoe. When these characteristics were entered into the topographic mapping system, the area of suspicion was gradually narrowed to regions combining steep gradients, limited access routes, and great distance from populated areas, places where motorized travel could be conducted without leaving obvious traces on main roads. In parallel, investigators analyzed the perpetrator's possible routes of movement based on the established behavioral model, including approaching the victim on the water and then quickly departing the area without attracting attention. The plausible routes considered were not limited to current maps, but also included old dirt roads, seldom used trails, and former access paths once used for logging or extraction. Combining these factors showed that the perpetrator likely selected routes allowing flexible movement between the lake area and high mountain regions without passing through checkpoints or densely populated zones. When comparing the time during which Simon lost clear awareness with the geographic distances between Lake Tahoe and the suspected areas, transportation and terrain experts determined that travel to those regions was entirely feasible within the time frame Simon could not clearly recall, especially if appropriate vehicles were used and main routes were avoided. Data from the bag continued to play a pivotal role in narrowing the tracing range, as wear marks and signs of prolonged use in certain areas indicated it had frequently been placed on rough stone surfaces and sloped ground consistent with living in an uneven, non-level space. The biological samples not belonging to Simon, when cross-referenced with missing persons records in the region, showed significant geographic overlap between the locations where those individuals disappeared and the suspected zones already delineated. These intersection points did not form a simple straight line, but created a cluster of areas sharing similar terrain characteristics and degrees of isolation. When Simon's subjective descriptions of the confinement space were placed alongside this objective data, certain details became particularly noteworthy. For example, the fact that the space had no clear physical barriers yet still created a feeling of being enclosed, something only possible in locations where the natural terrain was harsh enough to restrict all safe exit options. Simon's description of changes in natural light with extended periods of darkness even during the day was compared with narrow valleys and mountain slopes that blocked sunlight for much of the time, helping to rule out many other areas and focus on more specific locations. Analysis of the perpetrator's likely travel routes also considered familiarity with the terrain, because maintaining a confinement space over a long period required stable access and deep knowledge of the surrounding environment. The identified areas all had characteristics that allowed one individual to move frequently without drawing attention, while also providing minimal resources to sustain long-term presence. When these layers of data were overlaid from Simon's statement, the collected physical evidence, terrain analysis, and the perpetrator's behavioral model, the area of suspicion was narrowed to the point where a specific location could be identified that fully satisfied all recorded conditions. This location lies deep within the Sierra Nevada, isolated from tourist routes and residential areas, featuring steep terrain, dense forest interspersed with rocky clearings, and signs of a space that had been used for an extended period without exhibiting characteristics of normal habitation. The identification of the specific confinement site did not rely on any single detail, but was the result of continuous cross-referencing among independent sources of information, where each piece of data only gained full meaning when placed alongside the others. The entire tracing process demonstrates that Simon Barrett's disappearance and return did not occur in a vague void, but were tied to a concrete physical space that could be delineated and pinpointed through the tight integration of the victim's statement and the remaining physical traces. The investigation was transferred to the FBI when the evidence showed that the abduction, confinement, and transport of the victim occurred across multiple jurisdictions, exceeding the authority of local agencies and requiring a high level of federal coordination. After receiving the case file, the FBI did not take immediate action but instead spent time thoroughly reviewing all the data that had been collected, including Simon Barrett's statement, the forensic examination results related to the bag, the analysis of the Sierra Nevada terrain, as well as Scott Pritchard's behavioral profile and history of violent offenses. The goal was to construct a complete operational picture of the subject's habits, mobility patterns, level of vigilance, and likely responses in a confrontation scenario. FBI units specializing in violent crime and behavioral analysis were mobilized to assess the actual level of danger, not only based on prior convictions, but also on the recent behavioral model, particularly the shift toward prolonged control rather than impulsive action. Based on these assessments, the arrest plan was developed with the guiding principle of gaining control of the situation from the outset, avoiding any context that might force the subject to resist or attempt to flee into rugged terrain. The planning included covert surveillance for a sufficient period to confirm regular travel routes, stable daily routines, and times when the subject was least likely to come into contact with others. Environmental factors such as terrain, weather, and motor vehicle access were analyzed in detail to select the most appropriate moment for approach. Rather than deploying a large force, the FBI opted for a controlled approach, positioning personnel at key points to block all potential escape routes without creating the immediate sensation of being directly surrounded. When the timing was finalized, the approach to Scott Pritchard took place in a low-tension environment, without any ostentatious display of armed personnel, in order to minimize the likelihood of an instinctive survival response from the subject. The agents identified themselves, announced the arrest, and issued clear, firm commands to comply. Pritchard did not exhibit significant resistance, did not use any weapon, and made no attempt to flee, allowing the arrest to be carried out quickly and safely. Throughout the process, strict safety protocols were followed, including a search of the person, securing the subject, and ensuring no latent environmental hazards were present. In parallel with the arrest, other FBI teams conducted searches of locations identified as directly linked to Pritchard's activities based on the prior tracing data and analysis. The searches were performed in full compliance with warrants and legal procedures, with detailed documentation of each area and every item discovered. At these locations, authorities seized multiple pieces of evidence clearly reflecting prolonged confinement conditions, including makeshift living structures, materials used to control light and space, traces indicating the scheduled distribution of food and water, and items supporting only minimal survival. Some items showed signs of repeated long-term use, inconsistent with normal habitation, and were individually sealed for in-depth forensic examination. Additionally, tools and materials potentially related to causing physical injury were collected, with forensic experts participating directly to conduct preliminary assessments on site. Biological traces, wear marks, and signs of crude usage were carefully documented for comparison with the injuries already identified on Simon Barret's body, as well as the previously unidentified DNA samples. Throughout the arrest and search operations, Scott Pritchard's legal rights were fully observed in accordance with regulations, including notification of the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney, to ensure the legality of the entire procedure and the evidentiary value of all collected material. Handling of the subject did not include on-site interrogation. The focus remained on stabilizing the situation, maintaining security, and preserving the scene and evidence. After seizure, all evidence was inventoried, sealed, and transferred to the FBI's specialized analysis units for further examination, while Scott Pritchard was placed in federal holding, pending subsequent legal proceedings. The entire arrest operation was executed according to a detailed plan in which every step was grounded in thoroughly analyzed data, with the objective of safely controlling the subject, avoiding unforeseen variables, and ensuring that every element related to the confinement and torture behavior was collected, preserved, and processed in full accordance with federal investigative standards. The examination of the confinement site was conducted under strict security controls, with the objective of fully documenting the current physical condition and collecting every trace capable of reflecting the prolonged human use of a space not designed for normal habitation. The location lies deep within the Sierra Nevada mountains, isolated from main roads, with winding and difficult-to-identify access routes, requiring specialized teams to travel by appropriate vehicles and approach in stages to ensure safety. The confinement space was not a complete structure but a combination of makeshift constructions and natural elements, featuring rock surfaces, compacted earth floors, and crude materials arranged to create shelter from harsh weather. Forensic teams carried out the examination in sequence, beginning with the central area, identified as the primary living zone, where the highest density of traces was present, then expanding to adjacent areas showing repeated use. Biological traces were collected from various surfaces, including ground areas frequently compacted by foot traffic, materials used as bedding, and points of repeated body contact. Preliminary analysis revealed overlapping layers of traces, reflecting long-term presence over time rather than a short-term event. In parallel with collecting biological traces, specialized teams documented and seized physical traces, such as torn cloth fragments, cordage, rudimentary tools, and materials used to restrict light, all showing signs of long-term use, with high levels of wear and many points repaired in a makeshift manner to continue functioning. These materials did not exhibit characteristics of voluntary outdoor living but reflected existence under controlled conditions, where every item was maximally utilized and rarely replaced. Areas identified as informal sanitation zones were also documented, showing long-term accumulation and a lack of basic disposal conditions, reinforcing the conclusion that the space had been used continuously without any improvement in living standards. When evaluating the overall scene, signs of prolonged confinement were clearly evident in the spatial distribution and traces, showing that the victim was restricted to a specific range despite the absence of obvious physical barriers. Natural exit routes existed but led into steep terrain, dense forest, and hazardous conditions, making departure in a state of severe emaciation nearly impossible. This layout demonstrated a control mechanism that did not rely on locked doors or chains, but instead exploited the environment to create psychological and survival barriers. Comparison of the scene with Simon Barret's statement was conducted systematically, focusing on key details rather than isolated minor descriptions. Elements such as the feeling of confined space despite no locked doors, the changes in natural light throughout the day, and specific areas where Simon described being forced to remain still for extended periods, all matched the structure and characteristics of the examined site. The locations Simon described as places where physical impacts occurred also corresponded to areas with higher densities of biological traces and greater wear on materials, indicating repeated activity at the same points. This level of correspondence was evident not only in the spatial layout, but also in functional use, reflecting a pattern of prolonged, coerced habitation. Forensic experts also noted the absence of systematic cleaning or comprehensive efforts to conceal evidence, indicating that the site had been used with a degree of confidence based on geographic isolation rather than on erasing all traces. The entire examination process was documented in detail through photographs, spatial diagrams, and scene reports, with each piece of evidence precisely located and linked to the context in which it was found. The collected data were categorized into biological, material, and environmental groups, allowing the construction of a comprehensive picture of how the space had been used over time. The completion of the evidence file was based on the convergence of multiple independent factors, from biological traces, the condition of items, terrain features, to the degree of consistency with the victim's statement, creating a highly interconnected chain of proof. This approach was not aimed at finding a single decisive detail, but at demonstrating the overall consistency of the context, where every small trace contributed to clarifying the nature of the confinement space. When placed alongside the prior medical and psychological evaluations, the confinement site emerged as a functional space maintained over a long period, where acts of control, restriction, and infliction of harm had left clear physical traces sufficient to reinforce the entire body of evidence related to the case. The prosecution process was built on the foundation of the completed evidence system, in which the federal kidnapping charge was established based on Simon Barret being approached, subdued, and transported against his will across multiple jurisdictions, with the complete deprivation of his personal freedom over an extended period. Prosecutors clearly presented that this conduct was not random or situational, but was carried out deliberately through tactics that first built initial trust and then employed measures of control that rendered the victim incapable of self-determination. Simon's removal from Lake Tahoe without consent, without the ability to communicate, and without any means to determine the route of travel, fully satisfied the elements constituting the crime of kidnapping under federal law, particularly in the context of conduct that crossed state boundaries and extended over many months. In parallel, the torture charge was established based on evidence showing that Simon was not only confined, but also subjected to systematic acts causing severe physical and mental pain and harm, carried out with the intent of testing the victim's endurance limits. Prosecutors argued that the control of food, water, sleep, and light was not a mere byproduct of harsh survival conditions, but intentional measures applied to weaken resistance and maintain a state of dependency. The act of amputating 2 of Simon's fingers was presented as a clear escalation within the chain of torture, having no survival or self-defense value, but instead intended to inflict irreversible injury and create a lasting psychological imprint. To support these charges, the chain of physical evidence was presented systematically, beginning with the bag Simon carried upon his return, one whose origin did not belong to the victim, showing signs of prolonged use and containing multiple biological samples that did not match Simon's DNA. Those samples, when cross-referenced with databases, showed connections to unresolved missing persons cases, reinforcing the conclusion that the confinement behavior was not an isolated event. Evidence seized at the confinement site, including makeshift structures, materials used to restrict light, minimal living implements, and overlapping biological traces, was introduced to prove the existence of a confinement space used over a long period. The degree of wear, Makeshift repairs and spatial distribution indicated this was not a short-term shelter but a location maintained for controlling a human being under severely restricted conditions. Medical evidence played a pivotal role in directly linking the defendant's actions to the harm inflicted on the victim's body. Simon's pre-disappearance medical records were compared with his condition upon return, revealing severe physical deterioration that could not be explained by a single accident or voluntary off-grid living. Medical experts detailed the chronic malnutrition, muscle atrophy, electrolyte imbalances, and signs of prolonged lack of medical care, all consistent with a pattern of controlled, cyclical food and water provision. Analysis of the left-hand injury ruled out accident, demonstrating that the amputation of 2 fingers was intentional, not medically motivated, and performed without appropriate follow-up care, reflecting calculated infliction of pain. These conclusions were supported by diagnostic imaging, scar tissue analysis, and independent opinions from multiple experts, creating scientific consistency. Alongside physical and medical evidence, conclusions from psychological and forensic experts were presented to explain Simon's mental state and how it aligned with the experience of prolonged confinement and torture. Psychological experts clearly described symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, including avoidance of memories, stress responses triggered by enclosed spaces, temporal disorientation, and fragmented recall ability. These manifestations were presented not to diminish the victim's credibility, but to explain why Simon's account could not be linear or complete, while affirming that such fragmentation was consistent with the pattern of severe, prolonged trauma. Forensic experts connected these assessments to the confinement site and physical evidence, demonstrating compatibility between the victim's psychological state and the actual conditions under which he was controlled. The entire prosecution process was constructed as a seamless logical chain in which each group of evidence, physical, medical, and psychological, supported and reinforced the others, proving that Simon Barret had been systematically kidnapped, confined, and tortured. This presentation did not rely on a single statement or a solitary piece of evidence, but on the convergence of multiple independent sources sufficient to establish the serious federal offenses and fully reflect the extent of harm the common victim endured throughout the period. His freedom was taken away. The trial was conducted in federal court with jurisdiction over the charges of kidnapping and torture, in a context where the case file had been fully prepared and the evidence system had reached a very high level of completeness. The jury approached the case not as an isolated event, but as a prolonged, structured, and deliberate sequence of actions that required simultaneous evaluation of both its legal nature and its level of danger to society. Throughout the trial, prosecutors presented the entire course of the case based on the physical evidence, medical conclusions, psychological assessments, and previously established behavioral analyses, emphasizing that Scott Pritchard's conduct did not stem from sudden impulse or momentary loss of control. The complete and extended deprivation of Simon Barrett's freedom was established, with the victim fully isolated from the outside world, unable to communicate, denied access to medical care, and placed in harsh survival conditions intended to maintain a state of dependency. The jury assessed the severity of the conduct through its direct and long-term consequences for the victim, including irreversible physical injuries, prolonged emaciation, and severe psychological disorders, all proven by medical records and expert testimony. In particular, the act of amputating 2 of Simon's fingers was regarded as a clear and significant escalation, demonstrating deliberate intent to inflict pain, and going far beyond any argument of accident or unavoidable circumstance. When considering the element of repetition, the court placed heavy weight on the defendant's prior homicide convictions and the evolution of his crime pattern over time, in which the behavior shifted from rapid deprivation of life to prolonging the process of inflicting harm. This shift was deemed particularly dangerous because it reflected the defendant's capacity for adaptation and increasing levels of cruelty, indicating a high risk to any individual if the defendant were to retain access to society. Summoned psychological experts confirmed that the defendant possessed full cognitive capacity regarding his actions, understood the legal and moral consequences, yet still chose to carry them out, ruling out any mitigation of criminal responsibility based on mental state. In the sentencing phase, the jury weighed the demand for proportionate punishment against the obligation to protect the community, while also considering the impact of the sentence on the victim and society at large. Mitigating factors were raised but not accepted, due to the absence of evidence demonstrating genuine remorse or any realistic prospect of rehabilitation in the future. When imposing sentence, the court applied the maximum penalty permitted within the applicable range, 3 life sentences plus an additional 40 years of imprisonment, fully reflecting the gravity of each individual charge, as well as the overall sequence of criminal conduct. The imposition of multiple life sentences was explained as an acknowledgement that each violation of human rights carried its own independent legal weight and could not be merged or diminished by the other offenses. The additional 40 years of imprisonment was imposed to ensure that, even under the most hypothetical legal scenarios, the defendant would have no opportunity to reintegrate into society. The jury also declared that parole or sentence reduction was excluded, based on a comprehensive assessment of prior record, current conduct, and risk of recidivism, concluding that any form of leniency would be incompatible with the public interest. This decision was reached after careful consideration of expert reports, emphasizing that the federal justice system has a duty to respond decisively to conduct that gravely violates human dignity and personal freedom. The sentence was pronounced as a final judgment, not merely symbolic or deterrent in nature, but as an affirmation that systematic kidnapping and torture will be met with the maximum severity proportionate to the level of harm inflicted on the victim and society. The consequences for Simon Barret did not end when the trial concluded, but continued as a prolonged process of treatment and adaptation, in which the first priority was addressing the permanent physical injuries that had formed during his confinement. Simon was enrolled in a long-term medical care program coordinated across multiple specialties, focusing on the aftermath of chronic malnutrition, muscle damage, and complications arising from extended lack of medical care. The loss of 2 fingers on his left hand was evaluated not only from an anatomical injury perspective but also from a functional one, as the reduced ability to grip fully directly affected daily activities and capacity for work. The recovery process included additional orthopedic surgery, extended physical therapy, and adaptive training so Simon could relearn basic motor skills under his altered physical condition. Doctors noted that the extent of the damage was irreversible, but properly directed intervention helped reduce chronic pain, limit secondary complications, and improve quality of life to the maximum possible level. In parallel with physical treatment, Simon participated in an intensive psychological therapy program designed for victims of prolonged violence and coercive confinement. Psychological experts identified post-traumatic stress disorder as central to the difficulties he faced, with symptoms including intrusive flashbacks, avoidance of stimuli related to enclosed spaces, sleep disturbances, and persistently elevated states of hypervigilance. Therapy was implemented on a long-term basis, combining individual sessions, cognitive behavioral interventions, and emotional stabilization techniques aimed at helping Simon rebuild a basic sense of safety. This process was not directed at erasing memories but at enabling him to coexist with those memories without letting them dominate his entire life. Experts noted that progress occurred slowly and non-linearly, with periods of stability alternating with flare-ups of symptoms, a pattern considered characteristic of prolonged trauma rather than a sign of treatment failure. In that context, the living environment was evaluated as a factor directly influencing recovery capacity, leading to the decision to change Simon's place of residence. Remaining in the familiar area tied to memories of his disappearance and captivity was identified as a high risk for re-triggering trauma, especially when elements such as landscape, climate, and open space evoked feelings of control and isolation. Simon, together with his support team, chose a new residence with clearly distinct environmental characteristics, prioritizing a moderately urban setting with easy access to medical services and a stable daily rhythm in order to minimize stimuli linked to his past experience. This decision was not an act of fleeing but was regarded as part of a structured recovery plan in which creating physical distance from triggering sources was deemed necessary to rebuild a sense of agency and control over his life. During periodic evaluations, Simon demonstrated gradual improvement in self-care and social interaction, although he continued to maintain a high level of vigilance in new or unpredictable situations. One decision with strong symbolic but clear psychological significance was Simon's choice not to return to Lake Tahoe. The place once associated with his everyday routine, his disappearance, and the beginning of the trauma chain, was identified as the space with the strongest potential to trigger distress, exceeding his current coping capacity. Psychological experts did not recommend direct confrontation with this location during the recovery phase, as forced exposure could cause more severe harm than benefit. Simon accepted that not returning to Lake Tahoe did not equate to failure or permanent avoidance, but rather represented an active choice to protect the recovery process and ensure long-term stability. In daily life, Simon built a new routine centered on highly predictable activities, maintaining his treatment schedule, engaging in light exercise, and carefully selected social relationships. These changes reflected a shift from a state of mere survival to one of recovery, even though the path ahead was still assessed as long and demanding considerable patience. Experts agreed that the consequences Simon had to bear could not be measured solely by physical injuries or psychological diagnoses, but by the complete restructuring of his life after having his freedom taken away for an extended period. The treatment, change of living environment, and protective choices were not signs of weakness, but necessary adaptive responses from an individual who had endured severe trauma and was gradually reclaiming control over his own life. The case file was legally closed after the federal court's ruling took effect, with all prosecutorial proceedings concluded and no further investigative branches or legal disputes remaining directly related to the kidnapping, confinement, and torture of Simon Barret. This closure of legal status means that the justice system has fully completed its role in determining criminal responsibility, imposing punishment, and eliminating any possibility of continued threat from the perpetrator to the community. However, for Simon, the conclusion of the case on paper does not mean the experience has ended in his personal life. Simon's current condition is documented by medical and psychological experts as functionally stable, meaning he is capable of self-care, maintaining basic independent living, and participating in controlled social activities, but it does not reach a state of complete recovery. The permanent physical injuries, especially the loss of 2 fingers on his left hand, and the secondary effects of prolonged malnutrition, have been treated to the maximum possible extent, yet they cannot be reversed. Simon has learned to adapt to these limitations through supportive methods and lifestyle adjustments, accepting that some previous abilities are no longer feasible and must be replaced with new approaches. Psychologically, periodic evaluations show that post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms are now controlled at a stable level. They no longer dominate his entire behavior or perception, but they persist as an emotional baseline that can still be triggered under certain conditions. Simon is able to recognize early signs of stress and apply trained techniques for self-regulation, though this requires continuous effort and is not automatic. The lingering effects of prolonged confinement are clearly visible in the way Simon approaches daily life, with a strong preference for predictability, stability, and high control. These changes are not considered abnormal or negative in the context of severe trauma. They are understood as a form of personality restructuring to adapt to a world after total freedom was once stripped away. After the case closed, Simon did not engage in any public activities related to the incident, did not appear in the role of social witness or spokesperson, and did not seek media attention. This choice reflects the need to maintain a clear boundary between the traumatic past and his present life, avoiding being continually pulled back into the victim state. Those who have followed Simon's recovery process note that he has built a highly structured life with a stable schedule, limited but meaningful social relationships, and long-term commitment to medical and psychological support services. Although he is no longer dominated by constant fear, as he was in the initial period after his return, Simon still maintains a high level of vigilance in new or unpredictable situations. The remaining limitations are clearly identified and not denied, including reduced tolerance for prolonged stress, heightened sensitivity to enclosed or isolating spaces, and periods of physical energy decline due to the cumulative effects of past injuries. Experts assess that acknowledging these limitations is a key factor in helping Simon maintain stability, because attempts to push beyond or deny them carry a high risk of symptom reactivation. In his current life, Simon does not define himself solely through the experience of being kidnapped, yet he also does not attempt to completely separate himself from it. That experience has been integrated into his self-understanding as part of his personal history, formative but not absolutely dominant. The closing of the case file creates a clear boundary between the legal process and his personal recovery process, allowing Simon to focus on maintaining stability rather than repeatedly facing mandatory procedures and recollections. Simon's current state is described as a fragile yet sustainable balance where safety does not come from every wound being healed, but from those wounds being managed, clearly understood, and no longer controlling his entire life. In that context, Simon's life continues not as a return to his former state, but as a new state built on the foundation of what was lost and what could still be retained. Simon Barret's story directly reflects very real challenges in contemporary American life, where personal safety is often mistakenly taken for granted, especially in familiar spaces like Lake Tahoe, a place regarded as a symbol of freedom, nature, and healthy living. Simon did not disappear because of recklessness or an obviously wrong choice, but because of a very ordinary moment of trust. An approach pretending to need help, occurring in a context where American society normally encourages a spirit of assistance and belief in others. The first lesson from this story is that the line between kindness and safety needs to be more clearly established in reality, particularly in open spaces where the feeling of freedom can easily lower alertness. The way Scott Pritchard exploited remote environments, using terrain instead of chains and maintaining control through gradual debilitation, shows that modern crime does not always manifest through immediate violence, but often through long-term calculation and psychological manipulation. From that, the story raises a second lesson. Survival ability lies not only in physical strength, but in the capacity for observation, adaptation, and patience, as seen in the way Simon feigned compliance to wait for an opening and ultimately escaped. On a deeper level, the long-term consequences Simon must carry from the loss of 2 fingers, ongoing psychological treatment, to the inability to return to Lake Tahoe, remind American society that legal justice, while necessary, does not equate to complete recovery. This leads to the final lesson. The community must recognize victims not only in the moment they survive, but throughout the entire long aftermath of trauma, respecting their boundaries, not forcing them to move on, and building sustainable support systems is the most practical way to turn justice into something truly meaningful in real life. If you feel that Simon Barret's story offers deep insights into the fragility of safety and the enduring resilience of the human spirit in the face of hidden violence, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in exploring authentic investigative cases rich with human value. Thank you for following until the very end, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue to uncover the stories behind justice and the echoes that are not easily forgotten.